The wind was a constant thief in the high desert, stealing warmth from a man's bones and reason from his mind. It scoured the canyons of the Diablo Range, peeling back the land to its granite skeleton, and leaving little for man or beast. Tyne knew its language. He had lived in its throat for 10 years, and its ceaseless whine was the only sermon he had any use for. His cabin was tucked into a crease in the rock, a stubborn knuckle of wood and stone clenched against the elements. It was a place built for one man, because one man was all that was left. He had come here after the fever took Mary and little Samuel, after the silence in their small clapboard house in the east became louder than any scream. He had walked away from the green and the damp, seeking a place so hard and dry it might parch the grief from his soul. He found the desert, and in its indifference he found a kind of peace. He worked a small, stubborn silver claim that gave up just enough to keep him in flour, salt, and bullets. He spoke to no one for weeks at a time, and his own voice, when he was forced to use it on his rare trips to the supply post at Redemption Gulch, sounded like rocks grinding in a dry wash. His face was a map of his life, etched by sun and sorrow. It was a face like a clenched fist, closed and hard and giving nothing away. The people in Redemption Gulch, a town that had long ago forgotten what it was being redeemed from, gave him a wide berth. They called him the Ghost of the Diablos. He didn't mind. Ghosts were left alone. It was on a day when the sun was a merciless hammer that he found them. He was checking a line of old, played-out shafts up canyon from his own, looking not for silver but for signs of cougar. One of his 2 pack mules had been spooked the night before, and Taine was a man who paid attention to such things. The entrance to the abandoned Lucky 7 was a dark mouth choked with scree and withered greasewood. It had been a bust, like most claims in these parts, and forgotten for a decade. But as he drew near, his mule, a stoic beast named Job, pulled back, its ears twitching. Tyne stilled, his hand resting on the stock of the Winchester in its saddle scabbard. The air was still, the usual drone of insects silenced. He listened, not with his ears, but with his whole body, the way the desert had taught him. There was a sound, or the memory of one, faint and thin like the cry of a kestrel caught on the wind. It was not a sound that belonged in the dark throat of a mine. He dismounted, his boots making no sound in the thick dust. He pulled the rifle, its worn walnut stock smooth and familiar in his hands. He moved to the edge of the shaft, the darkness within smelling of cold stone and something else, something stale and desperate. He called out, his voice a rough bark. "Hello, the mine." Silence answered. But it was a different kind of silence now. It was a silence that was holding its breath. Tyne was not a man given to flights of fancy. He dealt in rock, dust, and solitude. But he knew the feeling of being watched, and he felt it now. He leaned the rifle against the rock face and struck a match, cupping it, as he lit the wick of the lantern that hung from his saddle. The flame caught, casting a weak, fluttering yellow against the brutal white of the afternoon. He picked up his rifle again and stepped into the maw of the mine. The sudden chill was a physical blow, a cold hand on the back of his neck. The air was thick with the dust of ages, but beneath it was that other scent, the scent of long-held fear. The tunnel went back 50 feet before opening into a small chamber, where the original prospectors had given up. It was there, in the wavering halo of his lantern, that he saw them. At first he thought they were shadows, tricks of the light on the uneven rock. Then one of the shadows moved. There were 3 of them huddled together against the far wall. 3 girls, their dark hair a stark contrast to the pallor of their faces, their clothes thin silk garments that were shredded and stained, utterly wrong for this place of rock and grit. They looked like porcelain dolls that had been dropped from a great height and somehow not shattered completely. The oldest one, who could not have been more than 18, pushed the 2 younger ones behind her. She stood, though it was clear the effort cost her. Her chin was lifted in an attitude of defiance that her trembling frame could barely support. Her eyes, huge and dark in her gaunt face, were fixed on him. They held no plea, only a terrible, bottomless exhaustion and a flicker of feral defiance. She said nothing. The other two peered from behind her. One was perhaps 12, the other no older than 8. They were skeletal, their wrists like twigs, their faces smudged with grime and tears. They clutched at their sister's ruined dress, their knuckles white. They were not just hungry, they were being consumed from within, their life force guttering like a cheap candle in a gale. Tyne lowered the rifle, the absurdity of the weapon striking him for the first time. He had faced down claim jumpers and grizzlies with less apprehension. He took a slow step forward, and the oldest girl flinched. A small, sharp intake of breath, the only sound in the cavern. He stopped. He was a man of few words, and in this moment he found he had none at all. What could be said? He looked at their bare feet, bruised and raw on the sharp floor of the mine. He looked at the way the youngest one's eyes were glazed over, not truly seeing him, but looking past him into some feverish dream. He looked at the oldest, standing guard over her small, dwindling flock. He unslung the canteen from his shoulder. The slosh of the water was obscenely loud. He uncapped it and held it out. His hand was large and calloused, scarred from a life of hard labor. The canteen seemed a crude offering. The girl stared at his outstretched hand, then at his face. Her gaze was searching, trying to read the lines of his history, to discern the nature of the beast before her. Tyne held her gaze, keeping his own face as still and unreadable as the desert landscape. He had learned long ago that emotion was a liability. He was not rescuing them. He was solving a problem that had presented itself in his path. A rock to be moved, a fence to be mended, a life to be saved. It was all the same kind of work. After a silence that stretched into a minute, then 2, she took a hesitant step forward. Then another. She moved with a strange, broken grace, a ghost of a refinement still clinging to her. She reached out a hand that shook like a leaf in the wind and took the canteen. Her fingers brushed his, and her skin was cold, cold as the stone around them. She did not drink. She turned and knelt, murmuring something soft and liquid in a language he did not understand. She tipped the canteen to the lips of the youngest sister first, letting only a few drops pass. Then she gave some to the other sister. Only then, after her charges had drunk, did she allow herself a small, careful sip. She capped the canteen and held it back out to him, her eyes downcast. Tyne did not take it. He looked at the 3 of them, then back at the sun-blasted entrance of the mine. There was no choice here. To leave them would be a kind of murder. To take them was a complication he could not begin to measure. He made the only decision a man like him could make. He gave a single sharp nod. "Come," he said. The word was a piece of rust broken from his throat. He turned and walked back toward the light, not looking to see if they followed. He trusted the desperation he had seen in their eyes. At the mouth of the mine he waited, blinking in the harsh glare. A moment later a shadow fell across the entrance, and the oldest sister emerged, supporting the youngest, who stumbled, as if walking in her sleep. The middle one followed close behind, her hand clutching a fistful of her sister's silk dress. They stopped in the sunlight, looking small and fragile against the immense, brutal landscape. The oldest squinted at the vast, empty horizon, a flicker of something, despair perhaps, crossing her face. She looked at Tyne, then at his mule, then at the endless miles of rock and sand. Tyne said nothing. He turned and walked to his mule. He untied the bedroll from behind his saddle. It was not much, but it was soft. He looked at the youngest girl, who was now leaning her full weight against her sister, her eyes closed. He gestured to the mule. The oldest sister, May, understood. With a strength that seemed impossible for her wasted frame, she lifted the little one, Sue, onto the broad back of the mule. The middle sister, Lynn, scrambled up behind her, clinging to her small, limp body. May looked at Tyne, a question in her eyes. He merely nodded toward the trail that led to his cabin. He would walk. He picked up his rifle and slung the canteen over his shoulder. He took the mule's lead rope. He did not look back at the sisters. He simply started walking, his stride long and measured, his boots crunching a steady rhythm in the gravel. Behind him he heard the soft shuffle of bare feet on stone as May followed. They were a strange procession, a ghost of a man, 2 mules and 3 half-dead girls, moving through the unforgiving heart of the desert, toward a future as blank and uncertain as the empty sky above. The walk to the cabin was a little over a mile, a journey Tyne had made 1,000 times without thought. Now every step was measured. He was aware of the soft scraping sound of May's bare feet behind him, a sound of impossible endurance. He did not offer her a place on the other mule. There was no room, and more than that, he understood, in some deep unspoken way, that she would not have accepted. Her place was on her feet, guarding her sisters. When his cabin came into view, a dark smudge against the red rock, he felt a strange reluctance. For 10 years this had been his sanctuary, his fortress of solitude. Its 4 walls contained nothing but his grief and his silence. Now he was leading an invasion. He pushed open the heavy plank door. It opened into a single room. A stone hearth dominated one wall, cold and black. A rough-hewn table and 2 stools stood in the center. A bed, little more than a frame with a straw-stuffed mattress, was built into the far corner. Everything was Spartan, functional, and coated in a fine layer of dust. The place smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and loneliness. Tyne led the mule right up to the door and gently lifted the 2 younger girls from its back. Sue was limp and feverish, her breath coming in shallow rasps. Lynn was awake but silent, her eyes wide as she took in the strange, rough room. He carried them one by one and laid them on his own bed, the only soft place in the entire cabin. They curled together like puppies, seeking warmth and comfort in each other. May followed him inside, pausing just over the threshold as if she were a spirit, uncertain if she was welcome among the living. She looked at her sisters on the bed, then at the bare, hard-packed dirt floor, the dusty table, the cold hearth. Her gaze missed nothing. Tyne went to the hearth. He laid kindling and wood with the practiced economy of a man who had done it thousands of times. He did not have to look. His hands knew the work. Soon a small fire was crackling, chasing the chill from the stone and casting flickering shadows on the walls. He filled a pot with water from the barrel by the door and set it on the fire. From a wooden chest he took a handful of dried beans and a piece of salt pork. It was not food for the sick, but it was what he had. As he worked, he was aware of her, a silent presence at his back. He did not turn. When he finally did, it was because the room felt different. May was not standing by the door. She had found a worn broom, a bundle of twigs tied to a stick in the corner, and was sweeping the dirt floor. Her movements were slow, exhausted, but precise. She was not just moving dust, she was imposing order. A small, quiet act of defiance against the chaos that had consumed her life. She swept around his feet without a word, her head bowed to her work. When the floor was clean, she took a rag from a hook by the water barrel. She dipped it in the cool water, wrung it out, and went to the bed. She began to gently clean the faces of her sisters, her touch infinitely tender. She murmured to them in her language, the sounds like soft rain on a tin roof. Tyne watched her for a long moment, the handle of the spoon hot in his hand. He had built this place to be empty. He had cultivated his solitude like a crop. And in a single afternoon this slip of a girl was filling it, not with noise or demands, but with a quiet, powerful sense of purpose. She was turning his shelter into a home. The thought was unwelcome, and he pushed it away, turning his attention back to the bubbling pot. The beans softened. He ladled some of the broth into 2 tin cups. He took them to the bed. May looked up, her eyes wary. He held out one of the cups. She hesitated, then took it. She blew on the hot liquid before holding it to Lynn's lips. She did the same for Sue, who barely stirred. Tyne left the other cup on the floor beside the bed and walked back to the fire. He ate his own portion of beans and salt pork directly from the pot, standing. It was how he always ate. But tonight the familiar act felt crude. He felt the weight of her eyes on him. When he was done, he scrubbed the pot, clean with sand, and set it by the hearth. The day faded, the light in the doorway turning from gold to a deep bruised purple. The desert grew cold fast. Tyne brought in his bedroll and the saddle blankets from the mules. He laid them out on the floor near the hearth, as far from the bed as the small room would allow. This would be his place. He went outside to tend to the mules and to stand for a moment under the vast, star-dusted sky. The silence was different tonight. It was not empty. It was filled with the sounds of a sleeping cabin, the crackle of a dying fire, the soft sigh of a sleeping girl. When he went back inside, May was sitting on the floor by the bed, her back straight, keeping her silent vigil. A blanket was draped over her shoulders. She had not used the cup of broth he had left for her. It sat on the floor, cold and untouched. He picked up the cup and emptied it outside. He came back in and without a word took a tin plate, filled it with a small portion of the beans, and set it on the floor beside her. He also filled a cup with fresh water and placed it next to the plate. "Eat," he said. It was not a request. He turned his back to her and settled into his bedroll, facing the dying embers of the fire. He did not know if she obeyed. He lay there, listening to the quiet sounds of the cabin, feeling like a stranger in his own home. He had lived for a decade in a world of stone and silence. Now his world was filled with the rustle of silk and the soft sound of breathing. He did not know which was the harsher reality. The days settled into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. Tyne would rise before the sun, his movements quiet so as not to disturb the three figures in his bed. He would go out to work his claim, drilling and blasting and hauling rock, with the same dogged persistence he applied to everything. He was a man who understood the slow, grinding work of turning stone into sustenance. When he returned at dusk, weary and coated in dust, the cabin would be transformed. The floor would be swept, his few possessions arranged with a neatness he had never imagined. A fire would be burning in the hearth, and a pot would be simmering over it. May was a magician of scarcity. She could turn his meagre rations of flour, beans, and dried meat into meals that were, if not plentiful, at least savory. She found wild onions growing in a shaded part of the canyon, and bitter greens he had always ignored. She made a thin, nourishing broth for her sisters and baked a dense, flat bread on a hot stone by the fire. She never rested. When she was not cooking or cleaning, she was mending. She had unravelled the hem of her own ruined dress to get thread, and with a needle she had found in Tyne's small supply box, she stitched the tears in her sisters' clothes. She washed their single set of garments in the creek and laid them on the hot rocks to dry. Her hands were always moving, always working, as if stillness was a luxury she could not afford. Communication was a bridge built of gestures and single words. He would point to the flour sack when it was getting low. She would nod. The next day he would leave a new sack by the door. He noticed her feet were still bare and raw. On his next trip to Redemption Gulch, a journey he made with a new sense of urgency, he bought 3 pairs of small, sturdy boots. He left them by the door without a word. The next morning they were gone. That evening he saw the 3 sisters sitting outside the cabin, their newly shod feet stuck out in front of them, looking at the boots with a solemn wonder. Sue, the youngest, remained weak. The fever still clung to her, and she spent most of her days sleeping. May was her constant shadow, cooling her forehead with damp rags, trying to coax her to drink broth. One evening, Tyne came home to find Lynn, the middle sister, sitting by the hearth, trying to copy letters into the dirt with a stick. He stopped and watched her. She was drawing the strange, beautiful characters of her own language. He knelt beside her, the joints in his knees cracking. He took the stick, and in the dirt he carefully drew a letter. B. He pointed to the boots. "Boot," he said, his voice rough. Lynn looked at him, then at the letter, then at her feet. A flicker of understanding crossed her face. She pointed at the fire. Tyne nodded. He drew an F. "Fire," he said. Paragraph. Mai came and stood behind them, watching. He felt her presence, a warmth at his back. He pointed to himself. Tyne. Then he pointed to her. She hesitated for a moment, then spoke her name, the sound soft and clear. May. She pointed to her sister. Lynn. She gestured toward the bed where the youngest slept. Sue. It was the beginning of their language: fire, water, bread, stone. Simple words for a simple, hard life. But they were a start. They were the first stones laid for a bridge across the silence. Then the crucible came. It came not as a man or a beast, but as the sky itself, turning a malevolent grey. An early blizzard, a white devil roaring down from the high peaks, descended on the canyon without warning. The wind, which had been a thief, became a murderer, its howl rising to a demonic shriek. Snow fell not in flakes, but in a solid, blinding sheet, burying the world in white. Tyne had been caught out checking his snares. He fought his way back to the cabin, the wind tearing at him like a pack of wolves. He stumbled through the door caked in snow to find May trying to bar it against the storm. Her eyes were wide with a fear he understood. This was not the gentle snow of her homeland. This was a killer. For 3 days the storm raged. The world shrank to the 4 walls of the cabin. The wind howled, and the snow piled up against the door and the single small window, plunging them into a dim, perpetual twilight. The cold was a living thing, seeping through the cracks in the logs, trying to steal the warmth from the fire, from their very bodies. On the 2nd day, Sue's fever broke, but not in a good way. She began to cough, a dry, racking sound that tore at the fragile peace of the cabin. Her breathing became a painful rasp. Tyne knew the sound. He had heard it in the chest of his own son, Samuel. Lung fever. A death sentence in a place like this. May refused to leave her sister's side. She held Sue, rocking her, wiping her brow, murmuring to her. But her eyes, when she looked at Tyne across the dim room, were filled with a desperate, pleading terror. Tyne felt the old, familiar ice close around his heart. He wanted to turn away. He wanted to retreat into the stone-walled fortress of his grief, to let the storm and the sickness run their course. It was easier to feel nothing. But he looked at May, her face a mask of determined love and fear, and he saw the ghost of his own wife, Mary, sitting by Samuel's bedside. He could not turn away. He moved to the hearth and began to tend the fire, building it into a roaring blaze. He hung a blanket to create a small tent over the bed, trapping the heat. He melted snow for water and boiled it with the bitter herbs he kept for his own winter coughs. The cabin filled with the sharp, medicinal scent. He and May worked together in a silent, seamless partnership. He kept the fire going, his strength against the cold. She tended to Sue, her gentleness against the fever. They moved around each other in the cramped space, their shared purpose a language more profound than words. Late on the 3rd night, the storm's fury began to abate. The wind's howl dropped to a low moan. Inside the cabin, another storm was reaching its peak. Sue was struggling for every breath. May was weeping silently, her tears falling onto her sister's hot forehead. Lynn huddled at the foot of the bed, her face buried in a blanket. Tyne felt the walls of the room closing in. The past and the present were merging. He saw not Sue but Samuel. He saw not May but Mary. The grief he had kept buried for 10 years clawed its way up his throat. He had to get out. He stood and pulled on his coat. May's head snapped up. She looked at him, her tear-streaked face a question. She thought he was abandoning them. He couldn't explain. He just pointed to the water barrel, which was nearly empty. He took a bucket and opened the door, pushing against the heavy drift of snow. He stepped out into a world of impossible whiteness and silence. The storm was over, the moon was out, casting a cold blue light on a landscape that was both beautiful and deadly. He filled the bucket with clean snow and stood for a long moment, the frigid air burning his lungs. He looked up at the unpitying stars. He had come here to be alone with his ghosts. He had not expected them to take on new faces. He went back inside. As he knelt to melt the snow, May spoke, her voice quiet but clear in the still room. "My father," she began, and then stopped. She took a breath and started again, her English careful and formal, pieced together from the lessons of a missionary long ago. "My father owed a debt to a man in the city, a powerful man." Tyne did not look at her. He kept his eyes on the fire. "The debt was for our passage from our home. There was trouble. Famine. We had to leave. My father was a scholar, not a farmer. He had no money, so he signed a paper. He did not know what it said." She paused, her hand stroking Sue's hair. "The paper said he would work in the mines for 5 years, but the work was too hard. The air was bad. He and my mother, they grew sick, they died in the winter. The man, Mr. Croft, he said the debt was not paid. He said the paper, it was for the whole family." Tyne's hands, resting on his knees, clenched into fists. He knew the name. Silas Croft. A man who owned half the mines and all of the politicians in this territory. A man with a polished veneer and a soul like a lump of cold slag. He wanted us to work in his house, in Redemption Gulch, the house with the red lanterns. Her voice was barely a whisper. "We ran. We took nothing. We hid in the hills, in the dark places. We were there for many days. We had no food." She looked at him then, her eyes holding the full weight of her story. "Then you came." Tyne said nothing. He stared into the flames, but he saw Silas Croft's face. He saw the cold, acquisitive smile. He saw the house with the red lanterns. And he felt a hot, clean anger that burned away the icy fog of his own grief. It was an emotion so old it felt new again. Just then a small sound came from the bed. Sue coughed, but it was different. It was a wet, productive sound. She stirred, and her breathing seemed to come a little easier. The fever had broken. It had turned. May gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She leaned over her sister, her face illuminated by the firelight, transformed by a sudden, fierce hope. Tyne watched them, and for the first time in a decade the stone fortress around his heart began to crumble. He had faced down the storm outside and the storm within. And in the quiet aftermath he realized the cabin was no longer just his. It was theirs, and he would defend it. The snow melted under the relentless sun and the world re-emerged clean and raw. Life in the cabin found its new normal, but something had shifted. The silence between Tyne and May was no longer one of necessity or awkwardness. It was a shared space, comfortable and understood. The bridge of single words had been crossed, and now they spoke of small things, the weather, the taste of the bread, the way Lynn was learning to write her name in English. Sue recovered slowly, but her laughter, when it finally returned, was a sound that filled the empty corners of the cabin and of Tyne's heart. He found himself carving a small bird out of a piece of scrap wood for her. He did not know why. No, his hands just did the work. When he gave it to her, her small fingers closing around the smooth wood. Her smile was a treasure more precious than any silver he had ever pulled from the earth. But peace in the Diablo Range was a fragile thing. One afternoon, as he was repairing a section of the mule corral, he saw a rider approaching. It was not the shuffling gait of a prospector. This was a man on a fine horse, a bay gelding, with a proud head and an expensive saddle. The man himself was dressed in a tailored coat and a clean hat. He looked as out of place in the canyon as a diamond in a coal scuttle. Tyne put down his hammer, his hand moving to rest on the butt of the pistol he now wore at his hip. He had not worn it for years, but since the blizzard, since May's story, he had cleaned and oiled it every night. The rider pulled up a respectful distance away. It was not Silas Croft. This man was younger, with a lawyer's pale skin and shrewd eyes. "Mr. Thane?" the man asked, his voice smooth. "My name is Fletcher. I represent Mr. Silas Croft." Thane said nothing. He just waited, a granite statue of a man. Fletcher cleared his throat, discomfited by the silence. "It has come to my employer's attention that you are harboring property that belongs to him. Specifically, 3 Chinese girls who are bound by a labor contract signed by their late father. They're not property, Tyne said, his voice flat and cold. Fletcher gave a small, condescending smile. The law, I'm afraid, may disagree. The contract is ironclad. It conveys the labor of the father and his issue until the debt is paid. Mr. Croft is a generous man. He is willing to overlook their flight and the trouble they have caused. He merely wants what is his. They're not his. The smile vanished from Fletcher's face. Be reasonable, man. You are a solitary prospector. Mr. Croft owns this territory. He owns the sheriff, the judge, and the bank. You cannot win this. He is prepared to offer you $100 for their return. A finder's fee, let's call it. Thane thought of the 3 pairs of boots he had bought. They had cost him nearly a week's worth of silver. He thought of Sue's laugh and the wooden bird. He thought of May's quiet dignity as she swept his floor. Behind him the cabin door opened a crack. He knew May was listening. He knew her sisters were huddled behind her. "Tell Mr. Croft," Thane said, his voice dangerously low, "that he is not welcome here. Tell him if he or any of his men set foot in this canyon again, I will consider it a trespass." Fletcher's eyes widened slightly. He had not expected this. "You are making a grave mistake. Mr. Croft is not a man to be denied. He can have the law on you. He can have your claim revoked. He can ruin you." "Tell him to try," Tyne said. He turned his back on the lawyer and picked up his hammer, an act of dismissal more profound than any threat. He began to hammer a nail into the corral fence. The sharp, rhythmic sounds were the only answer Fletcher received. The lawyer sat on his horse for a long moment, his face a mixture of disbelief and anger. Finally, he pulled hard on the reins, turning his horse so sharply it reared. He galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and threats hanging in the air. Tyne did not stop hammering until the sound of the hoofbeats had faded completely. He finished the repair, his movements precise and deliberate. Then he put away his tools and went inside. The 3 sisters were huddled by the hearth, their faces pale. May stood before them, her hands clenched in front of her. She looked at Tyne, her eyes dark with fear and something else, a fierce, protective pride. "We will go," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "We will not bring this trouble to your home." Tyne walked to the fireplace. He picked up the poker and stirred the coals, though they needed no stirring. He looked at the 3 of them, May standing so straight and proud, Lynn trying to be brave, Sue clutching her wooden bird. "No one is going anywhere," he said, his back still to them. He looked up at the mantelpiece, at the empty space where a photograph of Mary and Samuel had once stood. "This is your home now." He turned to face them. He was not a man given to speeches. He did not have the words for what he felt. But he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he had just declared war. And for the first time in a very long time he had something to fight for. The week that followed was one of heavy silence and watchful waiting. The sky seemed to hold its breath. Tyne worked close to the cabin, his rifle never more than an arm's length away. He taught Lynn how to handle the small shotgun he kept for birds, showing her how to load it and aim it. The kick sent her sprawling the first time, but she got up, her jaw set, and did it again. May watched, her face grim but resolute. They were no longer just survivors, they were becoming soldiers in a war they had not chosen. During the long evenings, the cabin became a quiet fortress. While the sisters huddled together, May would often sit near Tyne as he cleaned his rifle. It was in one of these quiet moments that she brought out a small, intricately carved wooden box. She held it in her lap, her fingers tracing the patterns. What they were guarding broke him. The phrase from the user title echoed in my mind. This was it. "This is all we have left," she said softly, her voice barely disturbing the silence. "It is what we were guarding in the mine." Tyne stopped his work, his hand stilling on the cool metal of the rifle barrel. He looked at the box. It was made of a dark, unfamiliar wood, and every surface was covered in carvings of birds and flowers. May opened the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded silk, were 2 small porcelain jars sealed with wax. Beside them lay a man's simple jade ring and a woman's silver hairpin. That was all. "My father and mother," she whispered, touching the jars. "The priest at the mission helped us. He said it was right to keep them together." Tyne stared at the box. He saw not porcelain jars, but two small wooden crosses on a windswept hill in the east. He saw not a jade ring, but his own father's pocket watch, which he had sold for medicine that had not worked. He saw not a silver hairpin, but a lock of Mary's blonde hair that he had kept in a locket until the day he had thrown the locket, and his heart with it, into a fast-running river. He had thought his grief was a unique and solitary peak in a vast mountain range of sorrow. He had believed his pain was a wall that set him apart from all other men. But looking at that small box, at the ashes of a scholar and his wife, at the meagre tokens of a life left behind, he felt the wall crumble. His grief was not a mountain, it was a river, and it flowed into the same great, bitter ocean as theirs. The stoicism he had cultivated for a decade shattered. His face, the face like a clenched fist, finally broke. A single tear, hot and unexpected, escaped his eye and traced a clean path through the grime on his cheek. He did not wipe it away. He reached out a hand, his fingers trembling slightly, and gently closed the lid of the box. He looked at May, and for the first time she saw past the ghost of the Diablos, past the hard shell of the lonely prospector. She saw the man, shattered and remade. "I will not let him take you," he said, and his voice was no longer the flat, rough bark of a hermit. It was a vow. The vow was tested 3 days later. They came at dawn when the light was grey and uncertain. Tyne was already awake. He had not truly slept in days. He saw them from the window, Silas Croft himself, flanked by the town sheriff, a man named Blevins, with a weak chin and shifty eyes, and 2 hired thugs who looked as if they had been carved from rotten wood. Tyne's hand went to his rifle. He turned to May. "Take your sisters to the back. Bar the door. Use the shotgun if they get through." May looked at him, her eyes wide. She nodded, herded her frightened sisters into the small root cellar he had dug under the cabin floor, and slid the heavy bolt on the trapdoor. Tyne stepped out of the cabin, the Winchester held loosely in his hands, its muzzle pointed at the ground. He stood on the porch, blocking the door. Croft dismounted, his expensive boots sinking into the mud. He was a large man, soft in the middle, but with an air of absolute authority. He smiled, a cold, thin expression. "Tyne, I had hoped you would be reasonable. My man Fletcher said you were a stubborn fool. I see he was right." "Morning, Croft," Tyne said, his eyes on the sheriff. "Blevins, you're a long way from your jurisdiction." Sheriff Blevins shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Now, Thane, Mr. Croft has a legal contract. We're just here to enforce it. No need for trouble." "The only trouble here is the one you rode in with," Tyne said. Croft's smile tightened. "Enough of this frontier posturing. I have come for my property. Send out the girls, and I will forget this whole unpleasantness. I might even forget to have your claim filed as invalid." "They are not your property," Tyne said, his voice quiet, but carrying in the still morning air. "They are under my protection." Just then the trapdoor inside the cabin scraped open. May emerged, the shotgun in her hands. She was followed by Lynn, who held a heavy iron skillet like a weapon. They came to stand in the doorway behind Tyne. "We are not property," May said, her voice clear and ringing, her formal English sharp as a shard of glass. "We are people. Your contract is with the dead. We owe you nothing." Croft's face darkened with fury. He had expected a cowering prospector and weeping girls. He had not expected this united front of defiance. "Blevins! Arrest this man for theft! Take the girls!" Sheriff Blevins looked from Croft's enraged face to Taine's calm, deadly one. He looked at the rifle in Taine's hands and the shotgun in May's. He was a man who understood power, and while Croft's power was in money and influence, Taine's was right here, right now, and measured in lead. "Now, hold on," Blevins stammered. "This is a civil matter." "It's a matter of what's right," Taine cut in, his eyes locked on the sheriff. "And you know what this is, Blevins. You know it's not right." A stalemate. The air was thick with tension. The two thugs shifted, their hands moving toward their pistols. It was broken by an unlikely source. From down the canyon another rider appeared, pushing his horse hard. It was Henderson, the old cynical owner of the Redemption Gulch supply post. He rode right into the middle of the standoff, his face flushed. "Croft!" he yelled, waving a piece of paper. "A telegram for you! Came in last night from San Francisco." Croft snatched the paper, annoyed by the interruption. He read it, and the color drained from his face. His arrogance and fury collapsed like a house of cards, replaced by a pasty, slack-jawed shock. Henderson grinned, showing yellowed teeth. "Seems them railroad barons you were swindling ain't too happy. Federal marshal's on his way, warrant for fraud." Croft crumpled the telegram in his fist. He looked at Tyne, his eyes filled with pure hatred. He looked at May, at the sheriff, at his hired thugs who were suddenly looking for a way to be somewhere else. Without another word, he mounted his horse and galloped away, a ruined man fleeing the wreckage of his own greed. Sheriff Blevins watched him go, then tipped his hat awkwardly. "Well, seems this matter is resolved." He turned his horse and rode off, his thugs following like chastened dogs. Silence descended on the canyon once more. Henderson spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. He looked at Tyne, at May, at the shotgun. "Heard you had some trouble. Figured I'd bring that telegram out myself. Sooner rather than later." He winked. "Boots are on the house next time you're in town, Tyne." He too turned and rode away. Tyne stood on the porch for a long time, the rifle heavy in his hands. The sun was climbing, bathing the canyon in a warm, golden light. It was over. He turned and looked at May. Her face was streaked with tears, but she was smiling. Lynn was hugging her, and Sue had run out to join them, clutching her wooden bird. Tyne lowered the rifle. He leaned it against the cabin wall. He looked at the three sisters, their faces shining in the morning sun. He looked at the cabin, his fortress of solitude that was now a home. He looked at May, who met his gaze with an expression of such profound gratitude and affection that it took his breath away. The war was over. The work of living could begin. In the weeks that followed the confrontation, a new kind of quiet settled over the canyon. It was not the silence of waiting or the hush of fear, but the deep, peaceful quiet of a place secure. The ghost of Silas Croft and his threats faded like a bad dream, leaving behind the clear, bright reality of their new life. Word of what had happened, carried by Henderson and a suddenly righteous Sheriff Blevins, spread through Redemption Gulch. When Tyne next rode into town for supplies, he was no longer met with whispers and wide berths. Men nodded to him, their expressions holding a new respect. Henderson refused his money for a bolt of sturdy wool cloth and 3 sets of colourful ribbons, clapping him on the shoulder and telling him his credit was good forever. Tyne returned to the cabin not just with flour and salt, but with gifts. He laid the cloth and ribbons on the table without a word, a gesture that spoke volumes. The next day May began to sew. She worked with the same focused intensity she applied to everything, her needle flashing in the firelight. Soon she and her sisters had new dresses, simple and practical but made of warm wool and adorned with the bright ribbons. They wore them with a quiet pride, the colours a bold statement of life against the muted tones of the desert. The cabin itself continued its transformation. Tyne, who had never noticed the state of his own home, now saw it through their eyes. He built a new larger table so they could all sit together. He constructed 2 small beds for Lynn and Sue so they no longer had to crowd onto his old mattress. He watched, with a kind of quiet wonder, as May placed a jar of wildflowers on the new table, a small touch of beauty that changed the entire feel of the room. His shelter had become a home. Now it was becoming a place of comfort, a place of joy. One evening, as the sun set, painting the canyon walls in hues of orange and deep purple, Tyne found May sitting on the porch step, watching the colours fade. He sat beside her, not on his own step, but on the same one, the rough wood warm between them. They sat in silence for a while, a comfortable companionship that needed no words. "The stars are brighter here," she said, her voice soft. In the city you could not see them. Too many lights, Tyne agreed, too much noise. She turned to him, her expression serious. Tyne, I owe you a debt. He looked at her profile outlined against the twilight sky. You don't owe me anything, May. Yes, she insisted gently. A life debt. It is the way of my people. I will work for you. I will cook and clean for you for the rest of my life. Tyne was silent for a long time, the crickets beginning their nightly chorus. He thought of his life before them, a long grey road of empty days. He thought of the silence, the loneliness he had mistaken for peace. Then he thought of the sound of Sue's laughter, the sight of Lynn's determined face as she learned her letters, the feeling of sitting here now, with May beside him. He turned to face her, taking her hand in his. Her hand was small but strong, calloused from her work, just like his. It fit in his palm as if it were made to be there. This is not about debt, he said, his voice low and earnest. This is not about work. I am not your master, May. I don't want a servant. He took a breath, the words coming hard to a man who had not used them for a decade. I want a partner. I want a wife. He did not have a ring. He had no fine words. He had only this, his hand holding hers, his heart laid bare in the fading light. May stared at him, her eyes searching his. She saw the truth there, the raw, honest emotion he could no longer hide. A slow smile spread across her face, a smile that reached her eyes and made them shine brighter than any star in the desert sky. She did not speak. She simply tightened her grip on his hand and leaned her head against his shoulder. It was answer enough. They sat there as the last of the light bled from the sky and the vast dark blanket of the heavens unfolded above them. They were two broken people who had found their missing pieces in the most unlikely of places. He had saved her from starvation, and she in turn had saved him from a life without love, without hope, without a future. The next morning, Tyne began laying the foundation for a new room on the side of the cabin, a bigger room, one fit for a family. He worked with a purpose he had not felt in years, his hammer blows ringing out in the clear morning air, each one a promise, each one a testament to the new beginning they would build together, here in the heart of the desert that had against all odds become their home.